All right. Yeah, we all know what happened at Charlottesville recently. It's been all over the news, of course, but I wanted to give my take now that the dust has settled a bit. And I just want to take a moment to highlight a few key points that several people, a few, have touched upon. The great majority, the vast majority, still overlook. And, out of quote unquote emotional thinking, that is, following the urge to do what feels right, but without sober inspection on the actual issues and the consequences, it may actually make things worse. So, the analogy that I like to use, and this is somewhat of a side note, and, this kind of plays on the human instinct to sort of satiate immediate needs and not think of the long term. So, the human instinct would be to chop down all the trees, around your village because your immediate need is going to be firewood, right? Not realizing that the slow deforestation is putting you at risk, cumulatively over the years. As the trees disappear, the roots die off, there's nothing to hold the soil together, and then one year, much later on, after several years, but one year comes along and there's an annual monsoon, rain comes, we'll say, and a mudslide kills half of the villagers and wipes out your crops, and no one's thinking long term. So the natural tendency, in those situations, obviously, is to blame God or a deity of some sort, of course, because that's just another cognitive shortcut. And so this is the ultimate consequence of short-term thinking. That's my point. And this pattern repeats itself throughout history, and we see this all over the place. And, it's just sad to watch it unfold over and over and over again. Which, let me bring up my links here. Let's start our timeline, shall we? Because it's like, man, I'll tell you, every episode of, every dystopian future episode of The Outer Limits or The Twilight Zone, watching it unfold, and it's so trippy, and nobody sees it, and it's just another slow motion disaster. So let's bring this up here. White nationalist rally was set to be held. This was on the 8th, and this was on the 10th. This was published on the 10th, and we all know that the white nationalist rally was set to be held in Charlottesville, and that was reported on in advance. And a rally of which, proper permits were issued, and this is something that I kind of want to touch upon a little bit more in detail. A point I bring up because many have drawn a false equivalence to the Standing Rock protests. And, I stand with Standing Rock personally, but the reason they were tear-gassed and arrested is because the law was not on their side. They didn't have permits, and I know some people are going to be like, how can you say such a thing? But obviously the law is unjust, That's not, the greater argument could be made. Like, I'm not trying to explain away that, or I'm not trying to make any kind of false equivalence myself, but in this case, you have to understand, like, it's, people want to say, oh, they're brown, and, the Nazis are white, quote-unquote Nazis, and this is what's going on here. It's a case of racism. And in the case of Standing Rock, obviously, there's a lot more dynamics at play, and it's subtle, and you have to be able to read between the lines. And, in the case of Standing Rock, I surely think that when business interests are involved, they're always going to usurp the rights of citizens. I mean, there is inherent corruption at play there that has to be taken into account and really looked at versus, just a bunch of far right, quote unquote far right, because some of this stuff has been so exaggerated, the lines have been blurred so much that it's difficult to really determine. Like, these terms mean nothing anymore. But anyway, my point is that some yellow journalists on Twitter are either purposely misconstruing the facts, or they legit just can't see it because of their ideology goggles. I don't know. But the right to peaceably assemble is a right given to everyone under the First Amendment, no matter how toxic their opinion may be. And, so I think it's important to make that distinction. Now, moving on here. Yeah, so counter-protesters showed up. We all know this. And that's all well and good. They should have the right to do that as well. But, of course, it turned violent, which is not good. And, some guy plowed through a bunch of people with his car. The irony being that, a guy being on the far right likely I could imagine a situation where that guy, if he has a Facebook, which he probably does, and obviously I'm not going to go searching for people's Facebooks, but I'm sure if somebody digged, they could find, this guy, a rant that this guy went on against Muslims, I'll bet, on account of ISIS car attacks, only to use the same tactics, which is horseshoe theory. Everything comes back around, and, the radicals on either end of the spectrum, they're all going to lead to the same point eventually. So on that note, I want to bring up my next link here, is that it's interesting, and I mean, somebody explain this to me, because why would you... Anyway, okay, so it's interesting that 5 states have introduced bills to protect drivers who run over protesters. Just think about that for a minute. Think about that. Protections for vehicular homicide, for running over protesters. What is the aim there? This is what I want to know. What is the aim, if not increased political violence? And why? Again, so, all right, another interesting side note on that. Let me get to this. Another interesting side note is the amount of states that are allowing guns on college campuses. Now, with all the heated clashes on college campuses in recent months, right? We all know about Milo stuff and just all kinds of things going on, deplatforming, like Richard Dawkins and stuff like that. Even people like Dawkins, who's, mild really, compared to many, like someone like Milo, who's an obvious provocateur. Who in their right mind would think that throwing guns into that mix would be a good idea? Again, what is the aim there? Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I've said this in many videos of mine where I talk about political topics. I just ask questions. That's it. I observe and I ask questions. Now, what does this look like, right? I mean, if you wanted to ban guns or crack down on protests in a covert way, and you were the people in charge, how would one go about orchestrating that? So you have to give the people a 9/11, right, in order to pass the Patriot Act. And I know people are going to roll their eyes. 9/11, oh God, how can you say that? But I'm just saying, just think about it. Just think about it. That's just, the most obvious example. So Noam Chomsky brought up a great point in an interview with the Washington Examiner. He said, "When confrontation shifts to the arena of violence, it's the toughest and most brutal who win. And we know who that is. That's quite apart from the opportunity cost, the loss of the opportunity for education, organizing, and serious and constructive activism." Now, I don't agree with Chomsky on everything, as I don't agree with anyone on everything. But when you're right, and we have an intellectual obligation to consider all points honestly. And the reason why I bring him up is because something he said like really struck me, and it's the toughest and most brutal who win. Like, who are they? Authoritarians is who they are. It's not. I don't think that's what he was implying exactly. If you read the full article, he's implying the right. So people on the left will say the right. People on the right are going to say the left. They're going to point fingers. I mean, this is all just a silly, run around circle jerk. But regardless of whatever useless labels you do use, and at this point, they're like, again, they're so useless. I mean, these terms mean nothing. There's so much like obfuscation in the political realm now with just that nobody knows what anything means. There's no like, it's ridiculous. Anyway, the only thing you really need to know is an authoritarian is an authoritarian is an authoritarian, regardless of what flag they fly, what banner they wear around their arm, however they identify themselves. You can identify an authoritarian easily. They want to ban speech, they want to ban expression, they want to punish and restrict, what you can think, say, feel, all these things, we know. And these tendencies can be found all over the political spectrum, all over the we know. Horseshoe theory, I bring this up all the time. And, it's not just from the government, it's also from big business. They want to narrow your mind down to a sharpened pencil. And, the crazy thing is, the people are begging for censorship now. Begging for it. It's just, again, watching the dystopia unfold. Where one massive, government, business, multiplex will control everything. And all the media has to do is, what it's always done, the media has always done, and that is siphon the emotional energy of the masses with the constant fear of boogeymen. Oh, God. And the people will pray to be put in chains. Please put us in chains. We need safety. Just put us in a nice concrete box with steel bars. Paint a nice mural on the wall of trees, and we'll be happy with that. Man, I mean, believe me, it starts with the specter of the big bag boogeyman. In this case, recently it's white supremacy and neo-Nazis, but then the sphere of censorship is just going to continue to expand and expand, and suddenly not only is pro-Nazi speech censored, but then anti-Nazi speech will be censored. And then suddenly the rights of Nazis, quote unquote, again, because there are no Nazis. This is absurd. Some pudgy, autistic kid who's alienated and looking for meaning and gets confused and falls in with a bad crowd. This is not a Nazi. I mean, you have a 19-year-old who shitposts on 4chan and they fly, a Nazi flag. They want to be a part of something, whatever. There's so much more. The human dynamic is so much more in depth, and there's so much more subtlety here. But anyway, you're not going to get that from the media, of course. So suddenly the rights of Nazis to peaceably assemble is going to be restricted, and then the right to peaceably assemble is going to be restricted. And that's the real slippery slope, which is why I don't understand why those who favor suppression for hate speech assume that the authoritarians, won't someday see their views as hateful. I mean, we're seeing it already, and they just blindly go because what feels right is what feels right, and emotions win the day, and human beings are just rife with cognitive biases. So anyway, yeah, here we go. And another slippery slope is this urge to fight monsters, which is something that just keeps reoccurring. And Nietzsche put it best when he said, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into the abyss will gaze back into you. Think about that. I mean, something that the youth desperately need in this time of alienation, I think, is philosophy. And that's another road I can go down, but I'm not going to. But, here you go. I mean, look at this. I mean, first you tear down monuments, and then in your drunkenness for justice, you start tearing down the wrong monuments, and then at some point you start burning the wrong witches. And we see this pattern over and over again throughout history. When does it stop?